O Lord, my helper and my redeemer, I shall now tell and confess to the glory of your name how you released me from the fetters of lust, which held me so tightly shackled, and from my slavery to the things of this world.
Those are the words of Augustine as he recounts his journey from lust to grace. This remarkable journey of Augustine is John Piper's focus in this episode of Light and Truth. This biographical talk was originally given at the 1998 Bethlehem Conference for Pastors.
Augustine was born November 13, 354. His father, Patrick or Patricius, was a middle-income farmer, not wealthy, scraped together money to give him the best education he could in rhetoric. First in Madaura, 20 miles away from Thagast, where he was born, which is south of Hippo in northern Africa, in Algeria today. Then, between the ages of 17 and 20, he was educated in Carthage. His father was an unbeliever until the year of his death, and he died when Augustine was 16 years old. His mother, Monica, is very famous because of her relentless prayer for her lecherous son. And I'm not sure that she did the best job she should rearing him. He said, "As I grew to manhood, I was inflamed with desire for a surfeit of hell's pleasures. My family made no effort to save me from my fall by marriage. Their only concern was that I should learn how to make a good speech and how to persuade others by my words." So, poor Monica, she's included in that, as is his father. Then he said particularly about his father, "My father took no trouble at all to see how I was growing in your sight, O God, and whether I was chaste or not. He cared only that I could have a fertile tongue." Well, he left for Carthage when he was 17, and his mother, waking to the danger evidently, said to him that he should not commit fornication, and above all, not seduce a man's wife. And this is what he said: "I went to Carthage, where I found myself in the midst of a hissing cauldron of lust. My real need was for you, my God." He's writing this at age, 397, 354 from 397, 43. "My real need was for you, my God, who are the food of the soul. I was not aware of this hunger. I was willing to steal, and steal I did, although I was not compelled by any lack. I was at the top of the school of rhetoric. I was pleased with my superior status and swollen with conceit. It was my ambition to be a good speaker for the unhallowed and inane purpose of gratifying human vanity." So lust, theft, and conceit. He took a concubine when he was 16 and lived with her for 15 years and had a son by her, Adiotus, which means gift of God. To put his life in a nutshell, from that early schooling in Carthage on, he was getting trained in rhetoric to be a teacher. And so for 11 years, 19 to 30, he taught rhetoric. First in Carthage, then Rome, then Milan, and was basically a school teacher for young, aspiring, well-to-do Roman boys. And the next 44 years, he was a bishop. So you could sum his life up to say he spent 11 years as a profligate and 44 years as a celibate. Because once he was cured, he went all the way with chastity and would never come near a woman. And women were forbidden from entering the monastery where he lived, next door to the bishop's house or to the church. Now, here is an interesting thing. His conversion did not happen nearly as suddenly as it's made out often. We have to make things simple when we are telling little stories and sermons and whatnot, but I was apprised that this was a very long, drawn-out, agonizing thing. For example, in Carthage, when he was 19 years old, he read for the first time Cicero, specifically the Hortensius. And this had an effect on him which was a kind of first conversion. Cicero was a total pagan. There's no Christ in it. But he says, it altered my outlook on life. It changed my prayers to you, O Lord, and provided me with new hopes and aspirations. This is 11 years before his conversion. All my empty dreams suddenly lost their charm. My heart began to throb with a bewildering passion for wisdom and eternal truth. I began to climb out of the depths into which I had sunk in order to return to you. My God, how I burned with longing to have wings to carry me back to you, away from all earthly things, although I had no idea what you would do with me, for yours is the wisdom. In Greek, the word philosophy means love of wisdom, and it was this love that the Hortensius inflamed in me. Now that sounds really good. But he lived with his concubine, and he was a pagan for another 11 years. But what had happened was he experienced, by the providence of God, a lifting out of the groveling of lust in Carthage, at least to the level of caring about some truth issues. So don't begrudge pagan conversions to paganism. Don't begrudge that. That can be used of the Lord in the university. If you see a guy move out of living with his girlfriend to start reading Plato, rejoice. Don't give him any encouragement that that's salvation. But it might become salvation because it did for Augustine. Well, he fell in with the Manichees, and I don't want to take you through that long deal of 11 years of trying to understand this dualism and all that. When he was 29, big jump now, he went to Rome. But in Rome, these boys, these students, he did not like. They were very misbehaving, and so he looked for another place to teach as soon as he could. And in God's providence, he said, the Lord transferred him to Milan, north of Rome, Milan, Italy. And there two things happened. He discovered the Platonists, and he met Ambrose, the bishop. These are awesome things as he describes them, because the Platonists were his second conversion. He discovered Plotinus. Who cares and who knows about Plotinus? Died in 270, a Neo-Platonist, recovering the vision of Plato's ideas and forms, remember, from college philosophy classes. And he fell absolutely in love and appropriated this Platonism into his search for wisdom, so that it stamped him for the rest of his life. A lot of people write off Augustine today because they just say he's just distilled Christianized Platonism, which I think is a mistake. And he met Ambrose, this godly, truth-speaking bishop. Peter Brown, this biographer here, says that the discovery of Plato and Plotinus did nothing less than shift the center of gravity of Augustine's spiritual life. He was no longer identified with his God, as in Manichaeism. This Platonic God that he now met was utterly transcendent. So that's a next stage in his moving toward Christianity. Now you can hear the influence of his Platonism as he diagnoses in those days his own condition. Here's the way he described it. I had my back to the light, and my face was turned toward the things which it illumined. Remember the story of the cave in Plato. So that my eyes, by which I saw the things which stood in the light, were themselves in the dark. This is a Platonic analysis of his lost condition at that moment. Now here's the final move to closing with Jesus. Ambrose was 14 years older than Augustine and preached Sunday after Sunday, and he began to go. In fact, he became a catechumen, committed him to nothing. It was the thing to do. The aristocracy in Milan were all Christian. His mother had arrived on the scene and was trying to finagle a marriage for him so he'd get out of this concubinage with this woman who was below him in social class. It was just easy to do. So he signed on and started going to church. And this is what he said. In Milan, I found your devoted servant, the Bishop Ambrose. At that time, his gifted tongue never tired of dispensing the richness of your corn, the joy of your oil, and the sober intoxication. Now, let me just stop there. This man is brilliant. The sober intoxication. You just fly over things like that way too fast. If you read, David Wells said he has a hard time getting his students to read this book slow enough. I had to read. I did not see that until I typed it. Sober intoxication. That's all over the place in Augustine. Powerful use of language here. One of the things we're going to address now, we will again tonight, we will again tomorrow, is what David Wells said last night about this other worldview over against the therapeutic, psychologized, man-centered worldview. He used the words, I think, clear, winsome, powerful must be this world's view presentation. Augustine will help you, brothers, as does C.S. Lewis, and anybody who's lasted centuries will help you in this, to find language to commend God. Now I stopped in the middle of the sentence. Let's go back. At that time, his gifted tongue never ceased dispensing richness of your corn, O God, joy of your oil, the sober intoxication of your wine. Unknown to me, it was you who led me to him so that I might knowingly be led by him to you. That's also typically Augustine, that kind of language. So his Platonism liberated him from a mere quest for wisdom in the Manichaean heresy of being identified with God and a great dualism in the world to a transcendent God who he suddenly felt scandalized by in the Word made flesh. Utterly un-Platonic. This is why I said those who think he's just warmed over Platonism are not getting it. Because Platonism undergoes a radical criticism by the Incarnation in Augustine's own life. So Ambrose is preaching, and he says, I was all ears to seize upon his eloquence. I also began to sense the truth of what he said, though only gradually. I thrilled with love and dread alike. I realized that I was far away from you and far off. I heard your voice saying, I am the God who is. I heard your voice as we hear voices that speak to our hearts. And at once I had no cause to doubt. Now that was not his conversion. He just knew there's a God out there. He's transcendent, and I've got to discover this personal, transcendent God this Ambrose is preaching. That's where he was now. I was astonished, he says, that although I now loved you, I did not persist in the enjoyment of my God. Your beauty drew me to you, but soon I was dragged away from you by my own weight and dismay. With dismay, I plunged again into the things of this world, as though I had sensed the fragrance of the fair, but was not able to eat it. Now, in that sentence, I want you to notice the phrase, I did not persist in the enjoyment of my God. Because right here we begin to see the categories in which Augustine is framing his quest. And the interpretation Augustine is going to put upon his conversion and the theology of grace that he draws from it. Just like the Apostle Paul put on his own conversion and the theology of grace that grew out of that stunning event on the Damascus Road. He now conceived of his quest as a life in search of a firm, unshakable enjoyment of God. And that's going to be utterly determinative in his thinking about everything else, including his battle with Pelagianism near the end of his life, which is what I hear David Wells talking about. I'll try to say more about that in a minute. But now it wasn't intellectual anymore what he's being held back by. There's one thing. Sex. So wake up now. One thing is keeping him back. Lust. I was still held firm in the bonds of a woman's love. I began to search for a means of gaining the strength I needed to enjoy you. You see the issue he's shaping for us? Sex enjoyment or you enjoyment? That's the issue for Augustine. But I could not find this means until I embraced the mediator between God and man, Jesus Christ. His mother, who had prayed for him all her life, all his life at least, came to Milan, 385, the spring of 385, began to arrange this marriage for him with a girl who was 2 years too young to marry. I assume that puts her at about 14 or something. He's 30 or 31 here. And he is pressured to let this concubine go. And he sends her away after 15 years back to Africa and will never live with her again. Never in 5 million words does he name her. Quote, the woman with whom I had been living was torn from my side as an obstacle to my marriage, which he never consummated. He never did get married. And this was a blow which crushed my heart to bleeding because I loved her dearly. She went back to Africa, vowing never to give herself to any other man. But I was too unhappy, too weak to imitate this example set by a woman. I took another mistress without the sanction of wedlock. You talk about bondage. You got bondage in your church, in your life? There's hope. There's hope. So the day came. Let's go to the day. This is the day that everybody knows about. And this day's more complex, too, than I thought it was. But I don't have time for that complexity. What happened in the morning determined what happened in the afternoon. And all we know about is what happened in the afternoon. But in a nutshell, in the morning there was a visitor who told the story about Antony, a monk in Egypt. And as the story was being told about this monk in Egypt who with his disciples had heard of the gospel, had stripped themselves of all concubinage and all sexual lust and all possessions and sold themselves out to the monastic way of poverty and celibacy and service and went to Egypt in missionary labors, caused his heart to burn and to smite himself because he was in the bonds of lust as he heard the story and hated himself because of these stories that he was telling. That he was hearing from the visitor in the morning. This is the most important day in his life. It is one of the most important days in church history. O Lord, my helper and my redeemer, I shall now tell and confess to the glory of your name how you released me from the fetters of lust, which held me so tightly shackled, and from my slavery to the things of this world.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 4-part series on Augustine and sovereign joy. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.